Should comedy be sanitized or should it be allowed to be offensive? Should comedy be allowed to push bounds, or should we be concerned that comedy that some would find offensive is inappropriate and shouldn't be presented because of the harm it could do? That is really at the heart of a discussion that's been going on for the past few days in St. Catharines. Jeff Dunham, who's a very well-known, very successful, highly successful ventriloquist, one of the top-selling comedians out there, he has a performance coming up in St. Catharines on November 20th. In his act, there are some characters that are, well, there's some of his puppets include a dead terrorist named Ahmed and a totally legal jalapeno on a stick named Jose. They play on racial stereotypes, some of them. And there are those who say this should not be allowed to be happening in this city. Salih Wazardine is the chair of the City of St. Catharines Anti-Racism Advisory Committee. He joins us now. Thanks for doing this today.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Scott. As you said, I'm Salih Wazardine with the City of St. Catharines Anti-Racism Advisory Committee. And for us, it's not about what some people find funny, other people find offensive. It's about, like you said, the harm that's caused by normalizing racism, misogyny, and homophobia. And you've seen in Hamilton with open harassment on a city bus or racist road rage. Where do people get the idea that it's acceptable to do this? It's through normalizing racism and homophobia and misogyny, which comedy acts like this do. And you don't have to just take my word for it. Even a famous comedian like Jay Leno has said that, and he's come around and apologized for racism in his act. And he says that if comedians don't adapt to the new understanding or correct understanding of racism, they shouldn't be telling jokes. That's Jay Leno saying that.
And you know what? You're right about that. And yet at the other side, there are other comedians who have said, look, we can't sanitize humor. One comedian said, going to a comedy club and expecting not to get offended is like going on a roller coaster and expecting not to get scared. And there would be people who say comedy by its nature is always going to offend somebody. Is that not true?
Well, Jeff Dunham himself said that he doesn't want to be that offensive, but in one of his clips, he says he feels he has to be because that's what got him to where he is. That's what he's made his living off of. But that's the problem that, you shouldn't be making your living off of things that ends up really killing people and destroying lives. I mean, it's not an exaggeration. You've seen in London where a Muslim family of four was killed by a vehicle. And Statistics Canada has come out recently saying that there's a 72% increase over the last 2 years in police-reported hate crimes. So this is actually another pandemic of racism, misogyny, and homophobia. And that's why it's not just any kind of offensive content or anything like that. There's many other comedians who've recently been canceled by cities and venues, and those places have said, like you said, that comedy does push boundaries, but those boundaries are changing, and comedy's got to adapt. It shouldn't have been acceptable in the first place, but especially now with what we're seeing with the racism, it's not acceptable to make a living off of basically making a mockery or a butt of jokes of women, racialized people, and LGBTQ2SI plus people.
Okay, and Salih, I believe there are people listening who are agreeing with what you're saying for sure. I think there is definitely some agreement out there, maybe widespread agreement. Where though the tricky part here is if you say, well, we can't allow offense to certain groups or some offense, where does that line end? Because do we then freedom of expression and creative expression is something that there's a lot of concern that says, where does that then end? Are there only certain groups you can't offend, or would offending anybody, or should offending anybody then mean that you should not be given a stage to participate? How do you figure that out?
Well, let me let you in on a trade secret about anti-racism, Scott, that it's not that complicated. Actually, the Canadian government and the Ontario government have already listed the groups that are protected under human rights codes. So that's not something that, you and I have to make up. It's already been established. And it actually, it's pretty obvious when there's mockery and making the butt of jokes of groups that are being attacked under racism, misogyny, and homophobia. it's in South Africa, the South African Advertising Standards Authority, which is not a government body, it's actually an industry association. They themselves said, look, this character Ahmed, the dead terrorist, is racist and shouldn't be used. And Jeff Dunham tried to say, well, he's not actually Muslim, and the South African Advertising Standards Authority said, well, his name is Ahmed. That's one of the names of Muhammad, and you can see in the act actually he talks about Allah. So he's putting ideas out there that Islam is dangerous, which is actually the ideas behind Islamophobic attacks. So it's not that much of a mystery, actually. It's pretty straightforward. Not that
Does it
complicated.
matter? Does it matter when you're contemplating this? Does it matter that Jeff Dunham is a white guy doing this? If he was not, and the reason I ask that because a very famous, one of the most successful Canadian comedians ever, Russell Peters, much of his act is about racial stereotypes, and yet is it different if the person is a minority?
Well, I think you can see it's pretty big distinction between how Russell Peters does it and how Jeff Dunham does it. I mean, Russell Peters does make jokes from stereotypes, but he's pretty clear that he's not making a mockery of a whole group, or doing it in a way that normalizes making them the butt of jokes. But I mean, I think comedians themselves are also paying attention and changing their act. I mean, I talked about Jay Leno. There's other comedians as well who've said, look, we've got to change the way we do comedy. And it's not just comedy. I mean, this is happening all over. I mean, we had the Canada Games recently in Niagara, and the mayor had pointed out that they had to change the way they do the firing pistol in the games because of people with disabilities. So if sports can change, comedy can change too.
We got to run, but this show, as I understand it, reading the stories about it, this show is already sold out or close to sold out. And the city of St. Catharines has now said, no, we're not going to cancel this, but we may revisit this down the road. If it's sold out, that means there's an awful lot of people who still want to see him. What about the idea that a lot of people would then say is, look, let adults make their decisions. And if people are open to this or think that let adults can be adults and can decide for themselves, and the market will determine whether or not there's an audience for this down the road. What about that?
Well, I wish those of us who think it's racist could just put our heads in the sand and it would go away, but it won't. Whether we attend, or whether someone like me attends or not, the normalization of racism is still happening. And so it boils down to exactly the point you're making. What's more important? Is the harm that's caused by normalizing racism, homophobia, misogyny more important? Or is it more important not to offend those who think that we should just accept racism is normal and that it's even funny? And that's there's a long history in anti-racism of this exact problem. We can't have it both ways. You can't say you're a compassionate city, we're against racism. Racism has no place here. But when it comes to town, you say, oh, we have no choice but to lie down and do nothing because it would offend some people who think it's funny or want it to be normal.
Saleh Wazardine, chair of the City of St. Catharines Anti-Racism Advisory Committee. Thanks for the time today. Really appreciate the discussion.
Thanks, Scott. Really appreciate being on your show. Saleh Wazardine with the City of St. Catharines Anti-Racism Advisory Committee, as you said. Thanks.